Good evening, and welcome to our third Stanford Lecture of the academic year and our first public event of 2023. I'm Hugh Thomas, Director of the Center for the Humanities, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's talk. Before I introduce the speaker, I'd like to say a few words about upcoming events and about a couple of fundraising drives we have. As you can see from the rotating slides that were up just a minute ago, we have a number of events coming up this semester. And indeed, what was on that rotating list is only a partial sampling. I'll draw particular attention to the first of our faculty book talks for this semester, because it's coming this Monday at Books and Books, and it's by Professor Lillian Manzour in the Modern Languages and Literatures Department, and concerns her book on Cuban theater in the US. And our last Stanford lecture for the year is at the end of March, and will feature the prominent architect and scholar of African American Studies, Mabel Wilson. So for details on these and other programs, you can pick up flyers on the way out or go to our website at humanities.miami.edu. Now comes the really fun part of the evening where I hit you up for money. Though we are, of course, always happy to receive donations, this year we are having two specific fundraising drives to provide support for graduate education. One is the Ruggiero Prize to provide a monetary award for the best dissertation in the humanities each year. The other is the Suzuki Lindemann Kruse Prize in honor of some people who are very important for the center in its early years, including our founding director, and supports graduate travel to archives and libraries. We're hoping to get enough money this year so we don't have to raise money for them for a long time, and the money we get, the longer it will be before you have to hear similar pitches. So that's sort of my carrot along with a stick. And I'll say that graduate students are notoriously short on money because they don't get paid much and Miami is expensive. And so this is a fundraising drive where even a pretty minor donation will make a big difference. So for more information on that, I think we have flyers on the back on that, Christina?
Yeah, we have plenty of flyers.
Okay, great. And flyers on other things too. So now that I've got the money grubbing out of the way, I can turn to introducing our speaker. Kevin Kruse is Professor of History and Director of the Center for Collaborative History at Princeton University. He has written two widely acclaimed monographs. The first, published in 2015, is entitled, 2007, right?
2005.
2005, okay. Is entitled White Flight, Atlanta and the Making of Modern Conservatism. And the second, which is the one published in 2015, is One Nation Under God, How Corporate America Invented Christian America. And as an aside, I have to mention how jealous I am as a specialist in medieval history of the ability of Americanists to have titles that say exactly what it is and why it's important in a way that the general audience will understand, unlike the secular clergy, whatever they are, which I've written about. In addition to these scholarly monographs, Professor Kruse has co-written an overview of American history, co-edited 3 volumes of collected essays, and written a number of scholarly articles. However, Professor Kruse is particularly well known as a public intellectual, noted for his many op-eds and essays and appearances on radio and television. He's also a big presence on Twitter, which is how I was familiar with him even before a colleague nominated him to be the Stanford speaker. And let's just say that Professor Kruse is not a bystander in today's culture wars, particularly those focusing on US history. This evening's talk, however, draws directly from the research for his third scholarly monograph, and is entitled The Division, John Doar, the Justice Department, and the Civil Rights Division. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kruse.
Thank you so much, Hugh. Thanks for having me here. Appreciate everyone coming out tonight. I come from New Jersey, where the weather is awful. It's nice outside, and you guys have chosen to come inside here, so I thank you all for that. And today I'm presenting from a project that is still in development. I spent the past few years conducting archival research for my new book on John Doar, the Justice Department, and the Civil Rights Movement. I'm still literally sorting through all the materials as I prepare to write the manuscript, hopefully on a leave next year. To my apologies if this seems like a work in progress talk, because it is. The work historians do is a combination of the recovery of forgotten facts and the reinterpretation of conventional wisdoms. And obviously the former almost inevitably leads to the latter. At its most basic level, this new book of mine is an effort to recover the long overlooked history of John Doar, who served as the point man for the civil rights struggle. Excuse me, appointment for the civil rights movement in the Justice Department during the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. But in a larger sense, it's an effort to recover the often overlooked role that federal officials in general played in the civil rights struggle. That process of recovery will inevitably lead to reinterpretation of several aspects of the conventional civil rights narrative, I think. I see several likely challenges to the extant literature stemming from this work, but I want to single out just one for the moment. For decades, in its simplest terms, scholars have debated the best perspective for chronicling the civil rights revolution of the 1960s. In its most basic level, some historians have argued for a top-down account that places primary importance on centers of power in Washington, D.C., the White House, Congress, the Supreme Court, while others have made an equally powerful argument for a bottom-up approach that emphasizes the work of local activists at the grassroots. More than an academic disagreement, this debate sparked national headlines in the 2008 Democratic presidential primaries, when Hillary Clinton claimed that President Lyndon B. Johnson deserved primary credit for passage of the Civil Rights Act, while Barack Obama countered that no, it was Martin Luther King Jr. Ultimately, though, that simplistic binary at the heart of that historical debate does little to advance any real understanding of the civil rights movement, because change came not from the top down or the bottom up, but rather at the point where these two forces came together, and through the vital but vastly unappreciated work of men like John Doar. Let me illustrate this. For most of President John F. Kennedy's term in office, the civil rights movement was little more than a nuisance. Elected on a razor-thin majority by a coalition that awkwardly hung together white segregationists in the South and African Americans in the North, the Democratic president believed that the issue of civil rights would tear his party and his presidency apart. Accordingly, he proceeded with an abundance of caution, convinced that any action he would take on the issue at all would be doomed to fail. Kennedy took caution on civil rights to almost ridiculous lengths. As a candidate, he had promised to end all racial discrimination in federal housing projects, quote, with the stroke of a pen. But when years passed with no action taken, black voters started mailing him hundreds and hundreds of ballpoint pens in a mocking campaign they called Ink for Jack, until he finally moved. In some ways, the president made things even worse. Following the custom of letting senators steer judicial appointments in their home states, Kennedy installed dozens of Jim Crow federal judges across the South, entrenching segregation in the federal court system just when the civil rights movement would need it most. Activists were bewildered by his foot dragging on the issue. I'm convinced he has the understanding and the political skill Martin Luther King Jr.'s side, but so far, I'm afraid, the moral passion is missing. In the spring and summer of 1963, Kennedy finally discovered that passion. That May, the networks and newspapers brought home the brutalities of segregation. A civil rights protest in Birmingham reached their climax. Image of lawmen battering black children with high-pressure fire hoses, attacking them with German shepherds, shocked the nation. Even President Kennedy was moved by the pictures, confessing to his aides that they had made him, quote, sick. Just weeks later, in June, segregationist Governor George Wallace staged his infamous stand in the schoolhouse door at the University of Alabama. Wallace went to Tuscaloosa to block the admission of 2 black students to the all-white campus, and once again, the nation was treated to an ugly image of segregationists, sneering, defiant, and somewhat ridiculous. This time, though, Americans could see the federal government fighting back. Intervention from the Justice Department forced Wallace to back down, with a crowd of cameramen recording his retreat and broadcasting a welcome set of images to the nation for a change. Emboldened by this scene, President Kennedy impulsively decided to unveil his plan for new civil rights legislation that very night with an address from the Oval Office. The time for patience had passed, the president announced, and the course for action was clear. The civil rights bill he proposed that night would confront a range of discriminatory measures and empower the federal government to act with authority for its black citizens. I think we owe them, and we owe ourselves, he noted, a better country. For those at the grassroots and the front lines of the struggle, the president's address was a godsend. I've just listened to your speech to the nation, Martin Luther King Jr. wrote hastily from his home in Atlanta. It was one of the most eloquent, profound, and unequivocal pleas for justice and freedom of all men ever made by any president. NAACP President Roy Wilkins agreed, calling the president's address, quote, a clear, resolute exposition of basic Americanism. In Jackson, Mississippi, the family of the NAACP's field secretary, Medgar Evers, waited up late to see what he thought of the president's speech. And around midnight, his children heard the Oldsmobile station wagon pull into the driveway. Evers got out of the car, picked up a stack of sweatshirts stenciled "Jim Crow must go," and turned to enter his home. Across the street, hidden among some honeysuckle vines, a white fertilizer salesman named Byron Della Beckwith squinted through the scope of a .30-06 Winchester rifle, squeezed the trigger, and ripped a bullet through the activist's back. At the crack of the gun, the kids inside threw themselves to the floor, precisely as their father, a veteran of the Normandy landing, had instructed them to do. When no more shots came, they hurried outside to find him face down and bloodied in their driveway. Within an hour, he was dead. 4 days later, civil rights activists and leaders gathered in Jackson for the memorial service. Temperatures had soared into triple digits for more than 4 days, but 5,000 mourners still proceeded with plans for a 20-block march through town. As the pallbearers brought the body out and placed it in a hearse, a witness remembered, the tension in the city was as tight as a violin string. Officials had grudgingly approved this march, but only with a court order that mandated complete silence. Civil rights icons like Martin Luther King Jr. and Roy Wilkins accordingly led the memorial march softly and successfully through the streets. But when these dignitaries ducked into the Collins funeral home for a private service, those left on the street shed their silence. At first they sang "Oh Freedom" as a kind of funeral dirge, and then a more upbeat version of "This Little Light of Mine." A few hundred of the now hand-clapping crowd peeled away and began to move downtown, where panicked whites could hear their songs give way to shouts. "We want the killer. We want the killer." The Jackson police made their stand at Capitol Street, forming a long line of officers armed with shotguns, pistols, and tear gas. Canine units dispersed reporters from the scenes as fire trucks rolled into positions with water cannons. "Shoot," the crowd dared them over and over again. "Shoot, shoot, shoot." Protesters threw bottles and rocks at the police as others rained down debris from second and third story windings. When the cops clubbed several marchers and arrested a couple dozen more, the still shouting crowd retreated a block and braced for the onslaught of police. Between the two sides opened a long patch of asphalt, strewn with broken glass, sparkling in the sun. Suddenly, a lone white man appeared in the middle of the street. Tall and thin, with his shirt sleeves rolled up, his palms held out high, he walked slowly but surely towards the crowd. Crouching in a doorway, a reporter could only marvel that he looked exactly like Gary Cooper in the Western High Noon. One of the cops, worried that the crowd might not recognize the man, shouted that he should make sure they knew who he was. "My name is John Doar," he said, D-O-A-R. "I'm from the Justice Department in Washington, D.C., and anyone around here who knows me knows I stand for what's right." He pled with the crowd to disperse before any more damage was done to their lives and to their cause. Medgar Evers, he noted pointedly, would not have wanted it this way. Calling out the names of other activists in the state and rattling off their accomplishments, Doar said that they too would want everyone to head home. A few came to his side. Corps' Dave Dennis caught a man in an alleyway, aiming a rifle at Doar's head, stopped him right as he was about to pull the trigger. "John just said thank you," Dennis recalled with amazement, and took a bullhorn from one of the police officers and got the crowd more controlled. Miraculously, he convinced everyone to disperse. Now, it's impossible, of course, to note and know just how the various members of that crowd recognized the name John Doar. The more committed activists like Dave Dennis knew that Doar, the second in command of the Civil Rights Division, had been working in the Magnolia State for years. The federal lawyer had proven himself to be a friend of the civil rights movement, and more directly, a friend of Medgar Evers. 2 years earlier, Doar had sat down at Evers' kitchen table as the NAACP official provided the names of nearby blacks whose efforts to register to vote had led to political and economic reprisals against them. Following Evers' lead, the man from Justice, as he was known, searched out sharecroppers in remote cotton fields and took notes from nervous congregations in backwood churches. With painstaking legwork, Doar pioneered a new kind of civil rights litigation, one that managed to get results even in the Deep South. He quickly became a fixture in the federal and state courts across the region, tirelessly defending the rights of black activists. Even on the morning of Evers' funeral, the Civil Rights Division lawyer had been busy crafting 3 federal lawsuits challenging the improper arrest and savage beating of Fannie Lou Hamer, another activist in nearby Winona, Mississippi. Doar had taken some personal time to pay his respects at the memorial. Medgar was my friend, he told a bewildered white cop. But once again, he found himself called into service when the protest spun out of hand. Now, while committed activists knew Doar from the courtroom, other African Americans likely recognized his name from news coverage of the civil rights confrontations across the region. When a white mob attacked John Lewis and other freedom riders in early 1961, Doar was the one watching from a nearby federal building, relaying the scene to Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, as it unfolded, and swiftly securing protection for the activists. When James Meredith, seen here, fought to desegregate the University of Mississippi in 1962, Doar appeared in successive showdowns with the governor, the lieutenant governor, the state's attorney general, and finally row after row of helmeted policemen. And likewise, when two black students tried to enroll at the University of Alabama in June 1963, the very day Evers was assassinated, Doar was again on hand to stare down George Wallace in the schoolhouse door and escort one of the students to her dorm. Simply put, when African Americans in Mississippi and anywhere else in the nation saw the federal government standing up to Jim Crow officials in the South, it was usually the face of John Doar that they saw. Journalists who covered the race beat, as it was known, certainly knew John Doar. One reporter called Doar a model of, quote, rectangular rectitude, a straight-laced lawyer who had all the facts and, more importantly, a willingness to share them. As a result, Doar made for incredible copy. Once reporters realized that the man they called the fireman of the civil rights movement inevitably found his way to the heart of the action, they learned to track his movements as a way of tracking the movement, or at least they tried. In the summer of 1963, a reporter joined some colleagues for a late-night dinner. He had some important news. John Doar's in Birmingham, he told them. No, another objected. He's in New Orleans. No, a third said. I just saw him here in Jackson. You're all right, a fourth reporter said at last. He was in Birmingham this morning. He argued a case in New Orleans this afternoon, and he got to Jackson tonight. Newspaper and magazine columnists became infatuated with him as well, running gauzy profiles in publications ranging from the New Yorker to Newsday. The Pulitzer Prize winner, Jimmy Breslin, wrote a column about Doar that cast him as a heroic figure once again from a Hollywood film. His life has been in those nothing motels, on the highways, or in the dirty windowed hotels of small cities. It has been spent with people afraid to help him, or people who think about shooting him, in courtrooms where you can't win, and with politicians who won't listen. In truth, even those segregationists showed some grudging respect for John Doar. A reporter who transferred from an overseas post to cover the civil rights drama in the South marveled that white officials talked about this man constantly. One minute a sheriff was asking about this fellow Doar from Washington. The next minute the town's mayor was confessing how Doar had cowed him during a confrontation. Man, is he tough. Segregationists quickly realized he meant business and learned not to cross him. As the Atlanta Constitution publisher Gene Patterson once noted, John Doar was, quote, a man who will say things just once. Though they hated what Doar stood for, Southern officials nevertheless respected how he made that stand. Courage is a virtue which Southerners hold in high esteem, noted the black-owned newspaper, the Chicago Defender. That may be one reason why Doar enjoys the respect, and in a surprising number of instances, the warm personal regard of many white officials in the Deep South. Again and again, Jim Clayton of the Los Angeles Times echoed, one crossed his trail by hearing a sheriff talk about that quiet man from the Justice Department who was so terribly misguided, but who had so much guts. Indeed, the respect of white policemen is what landed Doar between the cops and that crowd in Jackson. The deputy chief of police saw him on the sidewalk and begged him to intervene, and without hesitation he did. In the weeks and months that followed that moment in Jackson, John Doar essentially kept walking that space between Southern officials and civil rights activists, just as he had in Jackson. In fact, those days surrounding Evers Memorial were so crowded with activity that Doar's newborn son went nameless for 6 weeks as his father crisscrossed the South. Eventually, colleagues in the Department of Justice literally forced the new father to draw a name out of a hat. As a result, his fourth child was named Burke after his boss in the Civil Rights Division, Burke Marshall. Occasionally, Doar stayed in Washington long enough to tackle important tasks, helping implement and draft the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the implementation of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. He spent a good deal of time in the federal courts, even the Supreme Court in Washington, D.C. Here he is alongside Attorney General Nick Katzenbach and then Solicitor General Thurgood Marshall after arguments on the constitutionality of the Voting Rights Act. But more often than not, Doar found himself deep in Dixie, solving conflicts as they cropped up. He became, in the words of yet another profile that invoked Hollywood's image of a Western sheriff, the Marshall Dillon of the troubled South. Although reporters often characterize him as a Hollywood leading man, John Doar was an unlikely hero for the civil rights movement. Doar had been born in 1921 in Minneapolis, far away from the South, and he grew up across the state line in the small Wisconsin town of New Richmond. He went to Princeton as a class of 1944 graduate, made a name for himself as captain of the basketball team. In an odd twist of fate, one of his roommates turned out to be a future colleague in the Department of Justice, Attorney General Nick Katzenbach. Doar served as the U.S. Army Air Force pilot during the Second World War, and when peace came, went off to Berkeley to attend law school. In 1950, as his classmates left the school and launched careers at top firms, Doar returned to Wisconsin to help his ailing father keep their small family law firm afloat. For the next decade, Doar ran the general practice in quiet obscurity. Then in the summer of 1960, he was in California working on a paternity suit when Harold Tyler, the new head of the Justice Department Civil Rights Division, CRD, tracked him down by telephone. Tyler had been searching for someone, anyone really, to serve as his second in command, but he'd had no luck. The CRD was only 3 years old and had no accomplishments to claim to its credit. No one with any standing wanted to join this dead-end job, especially not in the last months of the Eisenhower administration. When Tyler ran out of names to call, someone finally recommended that he try Doar, a fellow Princetonian who had shown a lot of promise in college but hadn't really amounted to much ever since. Tyler tracked him down and offered him the job sight unseen. Doar was caught by surprise. He took notes of their conversation on the back of a phone directory at the Hilton he was staying at. After sleeping on it, Doar accepted the offer. When Doar joined the Civil Rights Division in July 1960, he quickly saw how toothless and ineffective it was. The CRD had been established 3 years earlier in the Civil Rights Act of 1957. That law took the small civil rights section that had been a part of the Department of Justice since the New Deal and elevated it into a full-blown division. And that change was important for both stylistic and structural reasons. Having a division devoted to the cause of civil rights signaled that the Department of Justice took it as a top concern, equal with things like crime or taxes. And structurally, the elevation of a division meant that the civil rights work of the DOJ would now be led by an assistant attorney general with all the attendant resources and influence. And yet, when Doar arrived at the Civil Rights Division in the summer of 1960, he was stunned to see how all that early promise had amounted to nothing. Over the previous 3 years, the CRD had focused itself narrowly on just 3 voting rights cases. And worse, all 3 cases had gone absolutely nowhere. The problem, Doar soon realized, was that the CRD relied on the Federal Bureau of Investigation to provide evidence for its lawsuits, and the FBI had little to no interest in providing anything of use. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover famously saw the civil rights movement as a dangerous communist-inspired menace to law and order, and the men who worked for him understood their boss's feelings all too well. As a result, Hoover's agents provided clipped, literal answers to CRD inquiries, and their investigations often did little more than simply confirm publicly available news reports. At first, Doar tried to work within these constraints. He coaxed agents to give his lawyers more information to work with. But ultimately, Doar decided the FBI was useless in this regard and resolved to forge a new path for civil rights at the Department of Justice. The change came as Doar tried to address a voting rights struggle in 2 predominantly black counties outside Memphis, Tennessee. White landowners had systematically evicted sharecroppers who had dared to register to vote, but FBI investigations had gotten nowhere. As often happened, the Bureau's initial report just repeated facts that had already been reported in the press. They had better leads than that, though. A local white woman had given the FBI agents a copy of a secret employer's blacklist that contained names of local African Americans who had tried to register to vote and who were now being singled out with evictions, denials of bank loans and credit, and other economic reprisals. Shockingly, the FBI refused to investigate the blacklist at all. Frustrated at the lack of information, Doar decided to take things into his own hands. He would do some digging on his own, just as he had learned to do in his private practice when he had no one to rely on but himself. He flew into Memphis undercover and soon earned the trust of a local black school teacher who offered to drive him to the back country to meet with sharecroppers who tried in vain to register to vote. One night at a rundown clapboard church, illuminated only by candles, Doar asked the congregation if any of them had been forced out of their homes for registering to vote. To his amazement, just about every hand in the room shot up. Over the next 2 weeks, he took affidavits from 50 of them, collected eviction notices, and even convinced some sympathetic whites to make on-the-record statements as well. In a development that stunned officials in Dixie and D.C. alike, Doar put together a powerful case and won. And I should add here as an aside that Doar's detective work in the South didn't simply help make cases, it also helped make our narrative of the civil rights movement. Frustrated with the thin reports of the FBI agents, he crafted a new formula that required them to answer literally hundreds of questions, point by point, providing a wealth of information about local conditions across the South. This is an example of the questions he drafted for a 1961 voter registration case. This is one of the shorter ones I found, and this isn't even remotely all of it. Naturally, in Doar's line of work, evidence was everything. When a judge reprimanded Doar early in his career for not having a particular piece of information on his hand, the lawyer made sure he was never caught unprepared again, showing up with stacks of affidavits and exhaustive records. He goes in with evidence by the bale now, a reporter chuckled, but that judge was sorry he ever opened his damn mouth. But notably, Doar was concerned not just with the depth of the record, but the precision of its details. Whenever his lawyers submitted vague briefs, he sent them back to work with a demand for more facts, facts, facts. To illustrate his point, he once distributed copies of this Rolls Royce ad to them. He said it didn't claim the car was quiet, he noted. It asserted that the only thing a driver would hear at 60 miles an hour was the electric tick of the dashboard clock. The FBI was furious that Doar had invaded their turf with his own on-the-ground investigations, but the politicians who outranked them appreciated what he'd done. In the 1960 election, there were now 1,200 new black voters in Fayette County, Tennessee, and their votes went to Republicans as a reward for what Eisenhower's man had done on the scene. As a result, the county flipped to the GOP for the first time since Reconstruction. When Robert Kennedy took over as Attorney General in early 1961 and reviewed all the work the Department of Justice had done over the previous decade, he was most impressed, he said, by the results Doar had secured in the Civil Rights Division. I want to keep moving on voting, he told him, and he asked the Republican holdover to stay on the job. And so, in April 1961, Doar traveled to Jackson, Mississippi with a colleague, undercover again, to meet with Medgar Evers and to get new leads for new cases there. The NAACP field secretary guided them to dirt roads and back alley tenements, where they interviewed rejected voters and perfected a new form of voting rights lawsuits, taking Tennessee's model to the next level. As successful as he was there, Doar's role quickly expanded beyond the voting rights lawsuits as the civil rights movement itself expanded. Just a month later, the Freedom Riders launched their crusade to challenge segregation and discrimination in interstate travel. Knowing that John Lewis and his fellow riders would be met with fierce resistance when they made their way into Montgomery, Doar and his aide, John Siegenthaler, raced to monitor events from the federal building, which, as luck had it, overlooked the bus station. When a mob savagely attacked the Freedom Riders there, Doar relayed eyewitness reports to Washington. As Doar worked the phones upstairs, Siegenthaler raced down to intervene on the scene, but he was viciously beaten himself. He later said that as the Klansmen beat him, his first thought was to worry that he was bleeding all over the casual attire he borrowed from his boss, John Doar. In response to the Klan's assault on the Freedom Riders, though, Doar fought to get an injunction against the organization, traveling by boat at one point in the dead of night to the fishing cabin of U.S. District Court Judge Frank Johnson to get it signed. During the ensuing hearing, Doar laid out dramatic evidence of Klan involvement and effectively declared that the federal government would go to war with the white supremacist organization. And in the immediate term, he secured a restraining order that stopped further assaults on the Freedom Riders and secured the successful conclusion of their campaign. In the fall of 1962, the Civil Rights Division in Doar became embroiled in another aspect of the civil rights struggle as they coordinated the dramatic desegregation of the University of Mississippi, an event known as the Battle of Oxford. Doar and Chief U.S. Marshal Jim McShane were a constant presence at the side of James Meredith as he tried to register at Ole Miss. Together, the trio had 4 dramatic showdowns with state officials, most notably a tense confrontation at the state capitol with segregationist Governor Ross Barnett. The confrontation had a menacing tone, but it was occasionally broken by bleak humor. When Doar, McShane, and Meredith arrived, these 3 faces, Barnett looked at them and asked in mock confusion, "Now which one of you is Jim Meredith?" On the surface, such confrontations highlighted the tension between the Democratic administration in D.C. and Southern Dixiecrats across the South. But behind the scenes, the two sides secretly cooperated to orchestrate a solution that would secure the court-ordered desegregation of Ole Miss, but still let Governor Barnett, seen here, portray himself as a defender of the, quote, Southern way of life. There were a series of private calls between the governor's office and the Justice Department, during which the governor kept urging federal agents to get bigger and bolder. At one point, Barnett almost begged the Attorney General to have U.S. Marshals draw their guns and point them at his head so he could play the victim and say he had no choice but to back down. This private dance between the federal and state leaders has long been a staple of the story of Meredith and Ole Miss, used as a sign that the public displays of hostility were insincere and therefore insignificant. But the Doar papers show that the tensions between state and federal officials were much more pronounced than previously known, and indeed potentially deadly. While Mississippi's governor was trying to stage an armed confrontation, other state agents didn't realize this was merely for show. As I discovered in the Doar papers, a group of Mississippi Highway patrolmen gathered for a meeting at around the same time, where a leader asked for volunteers to assassinate James Meredith when he tried to integrate the university. A couple dozen lawmen volunteered to do the job. Luckily, word of the plot made its way to a former member of Ross Barnett's administration, and he passed word up to the governor, who realized it would be a disaster. He got him to call it off. But it shows the disconnect between the rank and file and the state police and their ostensible leadership. Though the assassination plot was averted, the Mississippi Highway Patrol still did everything in its power to undermine the integration effort. Although the state patrolmen were supposed to cooperate with federal agents in transporting Meredith from a nearby military base to the college campus, they proved to be more of an obstacle than anything. Several federal agents reported confrontations with the highway patrolmen, including one incident where a Mississippi Highway Patrol car tried to run a group of U.S. Marshals completely off the road. On the campus of the University of Mississippi, the federal forces set up camp at the Lyceum building at the heart of campus. Highway patrolmen were tasked with keeping outsiders off the campus and with providing a protective circle around the Lyceum, but they refused to do either job. Multiple witnesses later told federal authorities that the state cops had turned a blind eye to the outsiders streaming onto campus, waving them through checkpoints or instructing them how to sneak their way in through the woods. When these crowds formed around the Lyceum, state cops again made their sympathies clear. As the white mob vented its anger at the marshals, throwing rocks, bottles, and lit cigarettes and attacking their vehicles, the state police stood by, doing nothing. Several even offered advice on how best to flatten tires or disable motors. Inevitably, the campus erupted in violence that night, leading to the deaths of two men, a member of the mob and a foreign reporter in town to chronicle it. The federal and state officials who had been collectively tasked with preserving and protecting law and order turned to finger pointing. The state of Mississippi blamed the U.S. Marshals for the riot, asserting that the decision by the lead marshal to fire tear gas into the mob had sparked the riot. They went so far as to file criminal charges against Chief U.S. Marshal Jim McShane. But federal officials used the fact-finding techniques Doar had brought to the Civil Rights Division to conduct extensive FBI interviews with students, faculties, state and federal officials, etc. And their findings show quite clearly that state officials had lost control of the crowd long before that point. And again, these never-before-seen accounts are incredibly rich in detail. I use them in my classes. Here's the start of a particularly interesting one, in an interview with Ole Miss history professor Jim Silver, who wrote a famous book about the conflict called The Closed Society. Now, while the Doar papers show that the Ole Miss crisis represented a clash between the state government and federal government deeper than we even suspected, they also reveal that the power of the federal government was much more limited and much more fragile than it seemed on the surface. In the Battle of Oxford, the federal government was represented not by the military, but by U.S. Marshals. This is a deliberate choice. When Eisenhower sent paratroopers from the 101st Airborne to desegregate Little Rock Central High School in 1957, there had been considerable blowback to the use of uniformed troops in an American city. They used to put out stickers and pins that said "Brotherhood by Bayonet." Many segregationists at the time repeatedly compared what Eisenhower had done to the Soviet invasion of Hungary. After Little Rock, U.S. Marshals, lawmen in civilian clothing, had emerged as a preferred way to enforce the law. When Ruby Bridges integrated the public schools in New Orleans in 1960, she was accompanied by 4 U.S. Marshals. It was immortalized in a Norman Rockwell painting. But Ole Miss was a bigger battleground than a first-grade classroom, and the Justice Department knew it would need more than 4 U.S. Marshals. The problem was it didn't have a lot more than that. Accordingly, the DOJ cobbled together a makeshift force of marshals that was drawn from all corners of the federal government. They brought in Border Patrol guards from El Paso and Niagara Falls. They brought in federal prison guards from Leavenworth and Atlanta. They deputized them as temporary U.S. Marshals, slapped a tear gas gun on their hand and an armband on their wrist, and pointed them to the crowd around the Ole Miss campus. Seen from the inside, the federal government's awareness of just how weak its actual powers were, and at the same time just how strong it had to seem to be, provides a stark image of the logic and limitations of the federal government's approach to civil rights. After the showdown at Ole Miss, Doar's work in the state only deepened. In 1962 and 63, the Justice Department lawyer worked closely with civil rights legend Bob Moses, State Field Secretary for SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. When Moses first set off to organize African Americans across Mississippi, his colleagues at SNCC made sure they gave him a lifeline to use when trouble came, John Doar's home phone number. The two men became close friends, and Moses learned to lean on Doar for insight as to what was and wasn't possible. Together, they coordinated plans for the Mississippi Freedom Summer, a revolutionary voter registration campaign that unfolded in 1964. It was here that Doar really earned his reputation as the fireman of the civil rights movement, coming to the aid of countless activists when they were attacked by white supremacists or unjustly imprisoned by white authorities, or often both. As Doar well knew, the activists in Mississippi were risking everything. The assassination of Medgar Evers in the previous summer was merely part of a larger wave of white supremacist violence in the Magnolia State, a wave that seemed to reach its peak with the disappearance and death of 3 SNCC activists during the Freedom Summer: Jim Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Mickey Schwerner. Now, the federal investigation that followed their disappearance might be familiar to you, thanks to the 80s movie Mississippi Burning. But that film incorrectly places the FBI at the center of the narrative, and it was actually John Doar. Indeed, when the 3 activists went missing, the first person the local SNCC office contacted, even before the missing men's families, was Doar at the DOJ. Doar was the one who launched the FBI search that ultimately found the 3 men's bodies, riddled with buckshot and buried in an earthen dam. Most significantly, Doar prosecuted those responsible for the murders, an assortment of Klansmen and complicit cops who aided and abetted their crimes, in a pioneering court case brought on civil rights charges. The case, known as U.S. v. Price, showed just how difficult that task could be. The presiding judge was a notorious segregationist who routinely used racial slurs in court and publicly rebuked Doar as a meddling outside agitator. The pool of potential jurors, meanwhile, was filled with known Klan sympathizers and more garden variety white supremacists, which forced Doar and his aides to sift through their lives to find the fairest possible jury. This is a sample of their notes. Doar worked tirelessly on the case for 3 years, but it paid off. Doar won convictions of 7 members of the murder plot, including the deputy sheriff who oversaw the plan and the imperial wizard of the Ku Klux Klan who organized it. Despite the prominence of that trial, Doar's most significant work came in Selma. His role in Selma has long been obscure, but Doar was in many ways the reason it became the flashpoint in the civil rights struggle. He'd long been working to secure voting rights for African Americans in Dallas County, Alabama, but came to believe that the existing laws were not sufficient. Deciding that the time had finally come for the, quote, Gettysburg moment of the civil rights struggle, he encouraged activists to turn to Selma and turn up the heat. SNCC leaders came to his office in the DOJ and saw that he had a giant map of the South on one wall, covered with different colored push pins that tracked the different civil rights lawsuits Doar was waging all at once. It was a sea of blue, green, yellow, and red pins of varying sizes, a sort of pointillist painting of the region that only Doar could really decipher. He pointed to that clump in the center of Alabama and Selma, and he told the activists to head there. And they did, with famous results. Their protests in Selma drew national attention to the repression of voting rights in the South, especially when the movement's marches resulted in the death of 2 activists. Doar was on hand for the protest, coordinating the federal response to segregationist resistance. In the voting rights campaign climax with the famous Selma to Montgomery March, Doar actually led the way, driving in a patrol car a half-mile ahead of the march. The moment was so dramatic, the New Yorker's Renata Adler captured it in the famous Talk of the Town feature for the magazine. At the end of the march, Klansmen murdered a white housewife from Detroit named Viola Liuzzo, who'd come down to support the protest. Doar again led the prosecution of this murder case personally, facing the difficult task of winning over an all-white jury in Alabama, where the murderers were regarded as heroes. Shortly after the murder, an ad ran in the pages of the Birmingham News. "Do you need a crowd getter? I have a 1963 Oldsmobile two-door in which Mrs. Viola Liuzzo was killed. Bullet holes and everything intact. Ideal to bring in crowds." The Klansmen who killed her joked their way through the Liuzzo trial, assuming that nothing would happen to them. But just as in Mississippi, they ultimately left the courthouse with ashen faces. Doar convinced jurors in Alabama to hand down 10-year sentences. The biggest legacy of Selma, of course, was the Voting Rights Act of 1965, a piece of legislation whose inspiration came from the struggle there and whose success in Congress owed largely to the dramatic sacrifices of activists there. Doar was vital in both drafting the legislation and, more important, overseeing its implementation across the South. Recognizing the rising tide of racial resentment on both sides of the color line, Doar called for swift, decisive action. "The only way to minimize the risk of violence in the long run is to make good on our commitment," he told his colleagues. "We've got to move from promise to performance, rapid, concrete, demonstrable performance." And he did just that, implementing the law that revolutionized politics in the South and the nation. He personally trained the federal examiners who spread out across the South to make sure the voting rights legislation was followed, to monitor local officials, and to protect the rights of African Americans. And again, in a sign of how shallow the deep state really was at this time, the Justice Department had to turn to another untapped reservoir of federal employees to serve as these new federal examiners. Here he chose to go with former IRS agents who retired across the South. As he helped implement the Voting Rights Act, Doar coordinated with countless black activists as they shifted their energies from protest to politics. This change transformed the partisan alignment in the South and led to the election of a new generation of black leaders like Charles Evers, Medgar Evers' brother, who soon became the first African-American elected mayor in a Mississippi town since Reconstruction. After 8 long years of work in the South, where he'd spent 2/3 of his time on the road, Doar announced that he was, quote, "bone tired" and looking to retire. He stayed on to wrap up a few lingering cases against the Klan, including a notorious one in Louisiana where the Hooded Order ran the town of Bogalusa. He also coordinated the federal response to the Detroit uprising of 1967, but he left the department at the end of the year. When he announced his decision to step down as Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, all sides of the civil rights struggle were stunned. The offices of Mississippi's Attorney General, there a lawyer, started around with a grin delivering the good news to his colleagues. "Hey, you hear about Doar quitting?" A reporter asked the segregationist Attorney General how many cases Doar had won against him over the years. Between 50 and 100, I guess. He won them all. Civil rights activists knew the score just as well. One Southern leader mourned Doar's departure as, quote, "the end of an era," while a leader at SNCC said it was a loss for all activists, as Doar, quote, "had been the one guy in the establishment they could get to." Those who had witnessed the voting rights legislation and the revolution that Doar helped make manifest through his work on litigation and legislation alike were especially stunned. "What, are you serious?" Charles Evers asked when a reporter broke the news. "I was just going to call John to tell him about the Negroes we got elected to office down here." "What are we going to do now?" Evers asked. "Who are we going to turn to?" The drama of Doar's life certainly continued after he left justice. He led the New York City public school system during the Ocean Hill-Brownsville strike of '68, and famously served as special counsel to the House Judiciary Committee in the Watergate scandal. But his role in the civil rights era remains unrivaled, if largely still unsung. Now the time has come to reckon with his impact, not just on the movement and the government of the 1960s, but on our world today. As Barack Obama noted when he awarded John Doar the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2012, I think it's fair to say that I might not be here if it had not been for his work. With this new project on Doar, I'm hoping to transform our understanding of the civil rights movement, the federal government, and the relationship between the two. As I noted at the start of my talk, a considerable amount of energy in the literature of the civil rights struggle tends to fall into two broad camps: bottom-up grassroots studies rooted in localities across the South, and top-down studies that privilege the high-level political actors in the White House, Congress, and the Supreme Court. As I hope I've shown today, the government officials who connected those two worlds are worth studying in their own right. But bringing them into focus should also change how we perceive the other two. Doar transformed the Civil Rights Division into a powerful part of the federal government, and in doing so, transformed the federal government into a powerful part of the civil rights struggle. We have to see all three components in relation to one another. Seeing the civil rights revolution from this fresh perspective that Doar provides will reveal not only new details about the movement, and there'll be a lot of them, but also a new understanding of the political change that came with it. In many ways, the current configuration of American politics, with Democrats arrayed along the liberal side and Republicans along the conservative, resulted from this collision of the civil rights movement and the federal government in the mid-60s. Before then, the parties were much more ideologically diverse, with large numbers of conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans alike. Doar's career offers a perfect chance to move past simple understandings of partisan politics and explore a range of political possibilities that have long since been forgotten. Liberal Democrats like to claim Doar as one of their own, as a kindred spirit, but he always characterized himself as a Lincoln Republican. Indeed, as two of his sons stressed to me in separate conversations, Doar only joined the Department of Justice because of partisan politics. He thought of himself as a good Midwestern Republican, and as such, he hated the exaggerated influence that Southern Democrats wielded in Congress because they supposedly represented large numbers of African Americans who could not vote. Extending full voting rights to blacks, he believed, would throw a wrench in all that, would undercut the Democrats, and give the GOP its fair share of power. While his partisan motivations faded in office, Doar continued to walk a delicate line. He was a Republican working for Democratic administrations in D.C. and working against Democratic officials in the South. Doar filed suits against state and local organizations of the Democratic Party, forcing them to abandon discriminatory policies, and as a result, forcing some segregationists to abandon the Democratic Party as well. In such ways, Doar's career illuminates how the civil rights struggle both transcended partisan lines and split parties internally. While Doar's role complicates our understanding of this era's politics, it virtually revolutionizes our assumptions about the relationship between federal, state, and local entities. When it unfolded, the great civil rights historian C. Van Woodward characterized it as a phrase that came to be very popularized, the Second Reconstruction, a phrase that highlighted the way in which unruly southern states and cities were once again being brought to heel by federal power. Early on in the civil rights struggle, that framing seemed to fit. Despite the Kennedy administration's best efforts, the Battle of Oxford only reinforced the trope of federal power being used to challenge southern systems of white supremacy. But the Civil Rights Division learned from those early clashes. If John Doar had been, in the words of Barack Obama, the face of the federal government in the South, he displayed a surprisingly light touch, a friendly face, one born out of his Republican belief in limited government and his recognition that too harsh an approach would backfire. Before imposing the will of Washington, he always tried to convince and cajole white Southerners to do their duty themselves. Indeed, he succeeded in securing those convictions for the Klansmen who gunned down Viola Liuzzo by pointedly reminding the all-white jury in a local Alabama court that either they could deliver justice themselves or the feds could step in and do it for them or perhaps to them. Perhaps most significantly, the story of John Doar and the Justice Department serves as a powerful reminder for our own time that our institutions actually do matter, and moreover, that the individuals who lead them matter too. Under Doar's leadership, the Civil Rights Division struck down segregation and discrimination throughout the South, helping integrate some major Southern universities. During the last administration, its resources were redirected to focus on the imagined threat of reverse discrimination in elite college admissions. Under Doar's direction, the Voting Rights Act helped reshape the political and legal landscape of the South, bringing black voters into full political power. In our own time, of course, the VRA has been eviscerated by the courts with disastrous results. Despite the frustration many Americans have today with their federal government and their growing mistrust of the people who work there, this vital history shows, I think, that the institutions of our country can indeed provide positive change and relief for ordinary Americans. All they need is an example like John Doar. Thank you. We have time for questions, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So do you want to handle the question?
Yeah, sure, yeah. Right there.
Thank you so much. I'm just a devil's advocate, so I'd love to learn about some of the devilish attributes of John Doar. A light touch was standing in between two fronts. Both fronts need to believe that they're might get something from
Right.
it. Could you share a little bit about what he was doing that upset the civil rights activists and
Yeah.
that allowed a soft touch with segregation?
That's a great. He was very aware of his sympathies were clear, but he also was very aware of the limitations of his role. And so, when they went into the Mississippi Freedom Summer, he went to a training ceremony held in Oxford, Ohio, where actually Andrew Goodman and Mickey Schwerner were at, two of the men who died. And he got booed because they kept asking him, well, you're going to protect us down there. And he said, I can't do that. That's not what the DOJ does. I can make sure if you're unlawfully arrested that we get you out of jail. I can make sure that if there are real abuses of this, we can file suits against this. But we're not a police force. We can't protect you down there. You're going to be on your own. And some civil rights leaders, Bob Moses, appreciated that. He'd been snowed by other people in the Kennedy administration, and he really liked that someone was being honest with him about what the limit of it would be. Others were very upset with him, so he got yelled at there. But I think it was that awareness that he didn't cross the line, and he was very much. His sympathies are clear. If you read he's very light in his papers. He's all about other people, but when he comes through, it's clear where his sympathies are. But he didn't lean on them the way in which other figures did. And this goes to how the Kennedy administration actually approached civil rights. They didn't put, again, because they were worried it was going to be too big of an issue, they didn't put the people who were actually the civil rights experts on their campaign, like Harris Wofford, into these roles. Burke Marshall was a corporate lawyer who specialized in taxation. And they put him there just because they thought he was a good lawyer and he could handle this. He had no background in civil rights. Doar, until this, had no background. And so they were just regarded as fair-minded lawyers who would play this role adequately. And they did. But Southerners, I think, saw that they weren't the kind of the fire breathers in the administration.
It was to avoid revolution.
Exactly right, yeah, very good. Yeah.
We have mics for anybody who wants to ask a question.
I sure can, yeah. How's that? I'm tall, thank you. Thank you for noticing.
Any other questions?
In the back there, yeah.
Michael?
Thanks for a great talk. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the politics inside the Justice Department beyond the Civil Rights Division. Given that there's friction between what he's doing and, say, other organs of the federal government like the FBI, I've got to imagine that within justice itself, people are of multiple minds about what the Civil Rights Division is doing and what he's doing in particular. So I'm curious for your thoughts about that.
That's a great question. A lot of the, on the lawyer side of DOJ, a lot of the internal rivalry is kind of blown away by the fact that Robert F. Kennedy has made his preferences clear. But these are his kind of favorite department in there. And so they've got the resources, they've got his ear. Byron White, when he was an assistant attorney general, led a lot of force to that too. So there's not a lot, at least that I found, say between crime and taxes, these other divisions kind of jockeying for power. The real tension, of course, comes with the FBI. And Hoover can't stand Robert Kennedy in general, but he really learned to hate Doar because Doar is constantly sending memos to his agents to get them to basically do their job, right? And so there are showdowns over this. In fact, I was just in the DOJ with Doar's son a week ago. We were in Hoover's office, Hoover's old office. And he had it set up where there was a table in the back corner. It was an old dining room, but he had command of his whole space. And he had his desk in the back corner with no chairs in front of it. So when people came in to report to him, they had to walk this long hallway and then stand in front of him as he sat down and kind of take the beating. He tried to do that with Doar a couple times, and eventually Doar found like a neutral place where they could meet. So they had a very hostile relationship, but neither one really had the upper hand. There was a lot of internal fighting there.
Thanks very much. That was fascinating. We have probably a number of people who come to mind who want to take a top-down approach to this history. We have several people in mind who want to go bottom-up. Could you fill out some of that panoply of this sort of John Doar register, if you will? I'd be curious to know some other figures.
There aren't a lot, and that's it's the people I've named. So Burke Marshall, who was originally the head of the Civil Rights Division, and then when Robert F. Kennedy leaves, Burke Marshall leaves with him, and Doar moves into that top spot. There's a host of people who work underneath him, who are kind of a great cadre of young lawyers, very young, 24, 25 in some of these places, who are in the trenches. Byron White is another one who's active there, who goes on to the Supreme Court early on and misses out on some of the activity, but he's involved in Jackson. But it really is Doar who stands out for this, and it's kind of remarkable to say that because, again, I think the reason we haven't had two reasons. One, his papers weren't available before. They've just been donated to Princeton. That's what this is based on. It's 230 giant boxes of material that are both the greatest thing I've ever found and the bane of my existence because I can't tell 5% of the stories in there. But also Doar had a habit of, and this is why it goes back to the question of how did he have such a light touch. He constantly gave credit to other people. He never took the spotlight. And so he was constantly saying, the FBI agent on the ground was very helpful in this, or thank you to the Attorney General of Mississippi for their help on this. They often didn't want those thanks. But he often farmed out those thank yous to different people, and so he's not really in the record. And the other lawyers aren't in the record either. But they work together as a kind of a really strong group. And that's what Doar, I think, really brought to the CRD. He organizes it. He really marshals the forces. And so as Robert F. Kennedy leads a charge to increase the number of lawyers involved in there, they have the resources now to go after this. They organize into regional divisions, and he kind of marshals these people like a field general. And it's remarkable to see the breakdown on some of these cases. So USB Price is a good example. He had, I think, a team of maybe 8, 9 lawyers on that. And they go, and it's okay, you're going to handle the first 3 witnesses, and you're going to handle the evidence on this, and you make sure you get the poster blown up on that. And they kind of marshaled it all together. They worked really well as a team. But he also trusted them to go out in the field and do things on their own. So there's this whole group of people in this middle layer, and it's a great question. It's what I'm trying to answer, but it's hard to answer because they've been so obscured in the literature. It's really been top down, bottom up. I mean, Burke Marshall is about the figure I think we've heard the most about in the DOJ in this time, just because he's inescapable. But even then, a lot of the stories are Robert F. Kennedy. They go up to the top of DOJ, right? And I would really want to look at the people who are on the ground doing the legwork.
Hi, thanks for a great talk. I was just curious, you say that he tries to avoid the spotlight, and yet in your discussion of the media coverage of him, he is the Hollywood celebrity prosecutor. So how do you balance those two things? And also, I want to hear more about how he utilized the press and his kind of elevated position in order to not simply give copy, but to shape the narrative and the public understanding of what's going on.
Great questions. Yeah, and the media one is a real conundrum because he's constantly in his papers. Anytime someone gives him, when he gets the USB Price convictions down, the congratulations come rolling in. There are files and files of these, and everyone he's giving. Say no, it's not me. It was this person, this team. He's constantly giving credit to other people. The reporters want to make him into this iconic figure. I think the show have been Jackson actually sets the stage for this. He's constantly giving credit to other people. The reporters want to make him into this iconic figure. I think the showdown in Jackson actually sets the stage for this. They put a face on that one showdown, and they elevate him. The way in which they had John Siegenthaler during the Freedom Rides incident, he is really the face of the federal government on the ground. Once that Jackson happens, Doar becomes the stand-in for them. He constantly hates the spotlight because it leads to the kind of resistance on the ground. The sheriffs respect the guy doing the legwork. They don't want the media hog, right? And I think he also is worried about Hoover, who was very much a camera hog, resenting of someone stealing the thunder. So I'm trying to sort that out. It's a question I'm grappling with myself right now. I'm afraid I don't have a great answer for that. As for the, what was this, the relationship with the media?
Yeah, I'm just kind of how you used that, his public platform.
Yeah. He was very well aware for as much time as he spent in courts of law, but the court of public opinion was just as important. So unlike other lawyers who didn't have time for the press, he was constantly willing to share details of them and to bring them around to present the government's point of view so they could relay it to readers and sway public support behind these campaigns.
I have a
Yeah.
question, if you don't mind. Just looking at the audience, we have a number of students in the audience,
Mhm.
and you mentioned 230 boxes
Yeah.
of John Doar papers at Princeton. I'm just wondering if you can comment on the process of sifting through that, what archival research is like, you know, what fed your presentation. It's a lot of work.
It's a lot of work,
Yeah.
but it's fun. I mean, this is what I love about history is we're equal parts detectives and storytellers, and usually the detective work is a little harder. We were sharing stories earlier with Hugh about some of the things I've had to go to great lengths to dig up. This landed almost literally in my lap. I got a note from the archivist saying, "Hey, we've got this collection. Do you know anything about this guy? Could you write a sentence for me for the press release?" And I couldn't write less than a paragraph. And once I did that, I thought, this is going to be a great book for somebody. This should be my book. So, and the fact that it was in my backyard, almost literally, was amazing. I didn't have to travel. I've got small kids, so it was a kind of a godsend to have it there. The process, though, is the real joy. And with some archives, you go through and it's dead end after dead end. I use the metaphor of drilling dry wells, and it just, you spend all day in there and nothing happens, and maybe one day you finally hit something. With the Doar papers, it's just gold. Everything is amazing. The amount of detail that's in these is phenomenal. And to go through, every day I would find something new and exciting and kind of startling, things that I thought weren't going to be available. Again, like the notes they've got on the these notes on the jury. This is the grand jury pool. They've got about 230 names they sort through here, and they've done interviews with local sheriffs and FBI and town politicians and figured out who these all people are. I could do a book on the jury selection pool of this. I mean, just the amount of social history you can draw out of this, amount of detail there. For the Meredith case, the amount of FBI interviews. I showed you a little bit of the Jim Silver one. Again, I assign these in my classes because they're incredibly rich in detail, and they're with students, faculty members, locals, school administrators, federal officials, state lawmen, and they're phenomenal. And again, things that we haven't seen before. And I'm trying to get my hand around all of this. The problem is, again, I want to tell every part of a story because the details are both so rich, but also I think so important in the transformation they're going to make to the narrative. But about the process itself, it's, you go in, if you've never done it, students, and you can do it here. Set up an appointment, come down, you'll have a finding aid, you can, they'll bring a box out, and it's, if you're a nerd like me, it's Christmas morning. It's the best thing to open these things up and to hold in your hand something signed by Martin Luther King Jr. or John F. Kennedy or Lyndon Johnson, to see the original FBI photos of the crime scenes in Mississippi Burning. I once, in my first book on segregationists, it wasn't a good feeling, but I opened a box and was staring at the robe of a Grand Dragon of Ku Klux Klan. So you never know what you're going to find in these things, and it's incredibly rich, it's incredibly rewarding. And then to be able to take that raw evidence and build it into a narrative, and to think about all the books you've read on a subject and what is new and exciting, and to realize that you've got something to contribute to that discussion is really exciting.
Thank you so much. One more question, I think.
Good.
Thank you for tonight. It was terrific.
Thank you.
You mentioned that he did undercover work, and I wonder how someone from Minnesota, Ivy League,
Yeah.
could manage to win over people. Did he have a team of on-the-ground people who were local?
No.
He said with
It was usually by way of recommendation and introduction. And so once he got in with Medgar Evers, that opened up a considerable number of doors. When he went in undercover, it was both to escape the notice of locals, but also to escape the notice of the FBI. He didn't want them to know that he was going down there. So undercover might be too. He was in street clothes. He took a flu commercial and that kind of thing, and didn't announce his presence. But in terms of making those introductions, it was really once he had someone who vouched for him, they would make introductions to other people, other communities, and they would pass it on. And then they got to a point where his name was known locally enough that we didn't even need those people to vouch for him. That's why in Jackson he could simply announce his name, and many people understood who he was.
All right, well, thanks very much, and I hope you all join me in another round of applause.
Thank you all. Thanks for coming out.